Okay, in part three, I'm going to look at the kind of Marxist critique of culture, pop culture, and capitalism, which is very much a critical theory position, and it kind of positions people as largely cultural dupes in terms of basically consuming through ideology. And then in the next part, I'll kind of look at more concepts that open up that kind of consumerism to kind of give humans a bit more kind of autonomy and agency, I suppose, in terms of how that works. So first, some key terms. So what I'm focusing on here in terms of media and pop culture and consumer culture here, I'm moving towards kind of the notion of consumer culture. This is the way that kind of we're living our lives, where we maybe express ourselves through the stuff we buy, through our music tastes and things we read, or the car you drive, or the food you eat, the places you live. And this is expressed, I think, through the notion of materialism. In sociological terms, this is where economic relations are the cause of social phenomena. It also refers to concern with accumulating personal wealth and goods at the expense of everything else. So consumerism here is kind of this notion that the things we buy kind of own us in that kind of Fight Club kind of way. So Marxist argues that essentially one of the reasons we are not rebelling and causing revolution is that we've kind of been sedated by all this stuff that we've distracted by. Where in the past maybe religion, in the Marxist sense, was the kind of great opiate of the masses, they argue that today the consumerism has replaced religion for that. So in this sense, the self, who we are, is this kind of commodified version of it. This position sees the way that we kind of display our self-identity through this kind of construction of the things we buy, the clothes we wear, and that kind of thing. So, and what's important there is we do that ourselves. We perform ourselves in that kind of Goffman-esque way through those things. But that means we also judge and engage with other people through that lens as well. So we'll talk about aspects of that throughout the rest of this lecture. An interesting thing here is the notion of commodity fetishism. This kind of way that we kind of fetishize goods. We give them all this kind of meaning beyond their actual use value. Shoes are a good example of this, like a pair of sneakers, with an Air Jordan symbol on them, tends to have these particular kind of meanings over those with, say, a Dunlop volley symbol on them, even though, they're essentially just the same thing, protecting our feet while we walk around. You can see this the way that people humanize stuff as well. People give kind of names to their cars or whatever. So this means there's a kind of symbolic value that's kind of given on top of the use value of the thing. And through this kind of notion of consumer culture, we tend to value the symbolic value more than the use value. Brands in particular are a good example of this. A suit made in the same sweatshop with no brand, and maybe if it had Calvin Klein or something on it, will be worth different things and has different meanings. Notion here too is kind of we live through this idea of hedonism, that our lives are kind of devoted to pleasure and happiness as a way of life. And through that, we do this through that kind of commodity fetishism. You can see that kind of fundamentally contradicts, the Weberian notion of kind of delayed gratification and all that kind of stuff. So this is a key change in societies through as capitalism has developed. If you're interested in the broader relations between production and consumption and climate and happiness, the Story of Stuff video is still, I think, really useful for kind of looking at this. It goes for about 20 minutes. It's a little bit dated now. I think it uses an old iPod Nano or something as an example, or kind of maybe even it's just a radio. But I think it does a really kind of elegant and efficient job of kind of putting a lot of the stuff together that I'm going to talk about in the rest of this lecture. So if you've got a bit more time, please check that out. So in terms of the kind of neo-Marxist ideas that I'm talking about here, the Frankfurt School have been particularly influential. These are figures like Adorno, Benjamin, Marcuse, Horkheimer. Even today, a kind of second, third generations of Frankfurt School theorists are still around. Jürgen Habermas is a prominent example. What they're interested in mostly is why all Marx's predictions about how the working class were going to have a revolution didn't really eventuate. And they're intrigued in particular by the way that things like consumer and popular culture have become our way of life, and they kind of therefore blame those things for that. So they have this kind of very critical approach. They're kind of concerned about how capitalism doesn't provide happiness and satisfaction and creativity for most people, and therefore intrigued by the different things that maybe people do that they see are against their own interests. So for Adorno there, we are living in a cultural cage where something is provided for all so none may escape. There's echoes of Weber's Iron Cage of Rationality here, but Adorno is pointing more here to pop and consumer culture as a kind of sedation, as a distraction from what these theorists see as our real needs. They kind of are particularly critical with the way that, like, what they see as wants, whether that's a new car or a new iPod or whatever, have become needs in our society today. And they see this in like an ideological thing. If we're all kind of grasping and desiring all these kind of shiny new objects, we're kind of trapped in this kind of capitalist self-fulfilling prophecy. Adorno and Horkheimer in particular were interested in the culture industries, and this is like, you know, the Hollywood and the big music companies and the gaming industry, and, you know, increasingly things like Netflix, and I would argue even the big social media companies are also part of the culture industry today. And to think about why, you know, workers that are in kind of alienated conditions are described by Marx, and, you know, as we'll look in the week on class, you know, real wages have barely gone up in the last 20 or 30 years, and cost of living has risen more and more. Why haven't people got together and done, you know, something about it on this kind of revolutionary scale? So what they did, you know, it was a kind of new thing when they were writing, is rather than focusing on work, they started to focus on consumption. And this is kind of seen as a key shift in social theory, from the kind of the production realm into the kind of consumer realm. They argue that essentially consumption mitigates aspects of alienation, but also therefore contributes to it, because there becomes this kind of competition involved in consumption to have the best things or the most status or the latest gear. This becomes a driver for satisfaction in our lives that can actually never be sedated. So the critique of the culture industry is really important to understand this. They kind of argue that essentially the culture industry has kind of replaced religion in terms of meaning in many senses, but also is this thing that keeps us bound into work. Because if we want to buy stuff, we have to work. We have to work hard. We have to earn more money. And so there's this kind of, you know, recursive relationship going on between those things. A really key, I think, concept to unpack some of this is the Adornian notion of pseudo-individualization. These critical theorists argue that pop culture and consumer culture do not provide kind of, you know, creative things. They don't provide difference, that all the things the creative industry tends to promote and provide us are largely the same, with just kind of small differences to try to make us, you know, think or feel that they're actually different. Example I think about this is when you go shopping. You know, you go to the supermarket and you walk into that aisle that seems to be like 20 meters long of like different washing powders. You know, there's like 50 different washing powders to use, even though they kind of essentially all do the same thing, but they're like in different coloured boxes. Seems to me a good example of the pseudo-individualization there, that like the same things in different coloured boxes, you need to find your own washing powder somehow to express yourself or whatever, but really they're all the same thing. In the culture industry, you know, things like films, songs, even novels, even like increasingly games, has argued that there's kind of not a lot of difference between them. They tend to be almost exactly the same thing, just packaged up differently, maybe done by slightly different people, but really there's a real formula going on to what's produced in the culture industry that isn't really creative, that very rarely expresses kind of any kind of political or resistive measures, and therefore we kind of consume it, and it keeps us in our place because we don't therefore think too much critically about the world beyond that kind of thing. Now, importantly, this perspective means that all pop culture is the same. You can't really make distinctions in it about good or bad, or you know, more political or less political. In this kind of realm, you know, a Marxist band like Rage Against the Machine, that in their songs kind of talk about the overthrow of capitalism, is pretty much in the same category as just, a pop singer that's singing about love, or singing about, or a rapper rapping about, buying an expensive car or something. So those two kind of examples I'm using there kind of are very obviously and kind of ideological in one way. The Marxist pop culture seems to be kind of resistive, but from this point of view, listening to Rage Against the Machine and jumping up and down at their concert or whatever and kind of screaming out, I won't do what you tell me, is a really good example of pseudo-individualization, because you're not actually, seizing the means of production there, you're just kind of singing about it, not actually doing it. Makes people kind of feel good, again, from this perspective, but it doesn't result in any real change. Now, I kind of have a lot of sympathies with that point of view, but I'm also quite critical of it. I use a band called Rage Against the Machine as an example because, in the 90s, they released an album that had a reading list, and, I was an electrical apprentice then. I hadn't read a lot of books, and I sought out those books and started reading. Fundamentally changed my orientation towards things and who I am. That's not to say that I've somehow led a Marxist revolution and changed things, but I think there's more going on than just kind of the cultural dupe notion of consuming pop culture there. And I'll talk about aspects of that more in a minute. Importantly here too, you can't use the pseudo-individualization argument for things you like against things you don't like. And in shoots over the years, that's often been a position that students seem to want to take. But I think, as a broader critique of pop culture, a lot of it rings true here. You can see the cartoon there of the kind of formulaic notions of different genres. You can see the endless sequels. You can see how essentially superhero movies largely dominate everything today. And so this is also the case when it comes to kind of buying stuff. And the iPhone is a good example of this. It comes out every year with a slightly updated thing going on. And as the story of stuff goes, points out, there's a lot of planned and perceived obsolescence going on in those consumer products that are, basically are mechanisms to make us buy more. So I think, from my perspective as someone that's very interested in pop culture, I do have those feelings sometimes that this kind of heavily critical perspective is right, but also as a consumer of pop culture and someone that's been affected by it in different ways, it doesn't always seem to ring true in terms of my own experience of it. So in the next part of the lecture, I'll talk about aspects that kind of grasp those things, I think. Another way of thinking about this kind of sameness is of consumer culture more generally is George Ritzer's very popular idea of McDonaldization. Now, Ritzer is kind of a sociologist very influenced by Weber. So what Ritzer essentially does is he updates aspects of Weber's orientation towards the world, of rationalization and disenchantment, and uses McDonald's as a kind of a lens to see how this functions, not just in the fast food industry, but across a whole bunch of different discourses and institutions. So writing in the late 80s, I think he started writing about this, where McDonald's was this kind of huge, ever-growing thing. It's kind of a bit weird now looking back that McDonald's isn't as dominant in terms of how it used to be, but in many ways, this McDonaldization made a lot more sense in the 90s than maybe it does now. But as all good theorists do, he's kind of updated this McDonaldization process over the years and talked about the Starbuckization of things. Other theorists have talked about the Disneyization of things. But essentially, they're kind of very similar ways of thinking about how the consumer culture has a homogenizing effect. So Ritzer pointed out how there was particular notions of control, efficiency, calculability, and predictability that McDonald's promoted that saw the franchise be really successful all around the world. But also those four things started to kind of leak beyond the fast food industry into more important realms, I suppose. Notions of control, efficiency, calculability, and predictability become part of health systems, for instance. And then this logic kind of can have really detrimental effects, what Ritzer called the irrationality of rationality. Again, the example that I used, I think in the first lecture, in terms of expressing private troubles and public problems, if you're sick and you need a hospital bed, if there's been a cuts in funding, rational cuts, that can actually have the irrational effect of more people dying. So Ritz's work has been, I think, quite useful for pointing out how this kind of consumption logic, often under what we call neoliberalism, has kind of leaked into kind of more important aspects of our lives, health systems, art, and many others. A good example of the calculability thing in education systems, for instance, is now you do like 12, 15 years of study, and what you come out with in year 12 is a number. Again, the experiences, the knowledge is as important as that number that kind of gets you to the next part of education. A good example of rationalisation there, I think. I've got some examples there you can click on as well to kind of go and see some artistic expressions of this kind of stuff. And also I think Chris Jordan's artwork about kind of waste, I think is a really interesting way to conceptualise some of the kind of more detrimental effects of consumer culture. Okay, so I'll leave that there and I'll come back in part 4 to talk about some more kind of open understandings of how consumer and pop culture works.